I sailed from Gravesend on July 23rd, 1726. For the details about the trip, I'll point you to my journal, where everything is explained in great detail. Perhaps the most important part of that journal is the plan I made at sea for how I would live my life from then on. It's even more remarkable because I made it when I was so young, and yet I stuck to it pretty faithfully all the way into old age. We arrived in Philadelphia on October 11th, and I noticed several changes. Keith was no longer governor. Major Gordon had replaced him. I saw him walking the streets like any ordinary person. He seemed a bit embarrassed to see me, but walked past without a word. I would have been just as embarrassed to see Miss Reed, but her friends, reasonably giving up hope of my return after getting my letter, convinced her to marry someone else, a potter named Rogers, which happened while I was away. However, she was never happy with him, and soon left him, refusing to live with him or use his name, as it was now rumored he had another wife. He was a good-for-nothing guy, though an excellent worker, which is what attracted her friends to him. He got into debt, ran away in 1727 or 1728, went to the West Indies, and died there. Keimer had gotten a better house, a shop well stocked with stationery, plenty of new typefaces, and a number of workers, though none of them were good, and he seemed to have a lot of business. Mr. Denham rented a store on Water Street where we started selling our merchandise. I worked hard at the business, learned accounting, and quickly became an expert at sales. We lived and ate together. He advised me like a father, genuinely caring for me. I respected and loved him, and we could have continued very happily together. But in early February 1726-27, just after I turned 21, we both got sick. My illness was pleurisy, which almost killed me. I suffered a lot, mentally gave up, and was actually a bit disappointed when I started recovering, regretting somewhat that I would now, at some point, have to go through all that unpleasant work again. I forget what his illness was. It lasted a long time and eventually killed him. He left me a small inheritance in a verbal will, as a sign of his kindness towards me, and, once again, I was on my own, because his executors took over the store and my job with him ended. My brother-in-law, Holmes, who was now in Philadelphia, advised me to go back to my trade, and Keimer tempted me with an offer of high yearly wages to come and manage his printing shop so he could focus more on his stationery store. I had heard bad things about him in London from his wife and her friends, and I wasn't keen on dealing with him anymore. I tried to find other work as a merchant's clerk, but, not easily finding any, I went back to Keimer. In his shop, I found these workers. Hugh Meredith, a Welsh Pennsylvanian, 30 years old, trained for farm work. He was honest, sensible, made a lot of good observations, read a bit, but was prone to drinking. Stephen Potts, a young man from the countryside, fully grown, trained for the same kind of work, with unusual natural talent and great wit and humor, but a bit lazy. He had hired them at extremely low weekly wages, with the promise of a shilling raise every 3 months as they got better at their jobs, and the expectation of these higher wages later on was how he had lured them in. Meredith was to operate the printing press. Potts was to do bookbinding, which Keimer, by agreement, was supposed to teach them, even though he knew nothing about either. John, a wild Irishman, who hadn't been trained for any trade and whose service Keimer had bought for 4 years from a ship captain. He was also going to be a pressman. George Webb, an Oxford scholar, whose service he had also bought for 4 years, intending him to be a typesetter. More on him later. And David Harry, a country boy, whom he had taken on as an apprentice. I soon realized that the reason he hired me at much higher wages than he usually paid was so I could train these inexperienced, cheap workers, and once I had taught them, since they were all under contract to him, he would be able to get along without me. Nevertheless, I continued very cheerfully, organized his printing shop, which had been a mess, and gradually got his workers to focus on their jobs and do them better. It was strange to find an Oxford scholar in the position of an indentured servant. He was no older than 18 and told me his story. He was born in Gloucester, went to grammar school there, stood out among the students for his clear talent when they put on plays. He belonged to the Witty Club there and had written some prose and poetry that was published in the Gloucester newspapers. From there, he was sent to Oxford, where he stayed for about a year but wasn't happy, wanting more than anything to see London and become an actor. Eventually, after getting his quarterly allowance of 15 guineas, instead of paying his debts, he walked out of town, hid his academic gown in a gorse bush, and hiked to London. There, with no one to advise him, he fell in with bad company, quickly spent his money, couldn't find a way to get involved with actors, became desperate, pawned his clothes, and had no food. Walking the streets very hungry and not knowing what to do, he was handed a flyer from a crimp, a recruiter for ships, offering immediate lodging and incentives to anyone who would sign up to work in America. He went straight there, signed the contract, was put on a ship, and came over, never writing a single line to let his friends know what had happened to him. He was lively, witty, good-natured, and a pleasant companion, but incredibly lazy, thoughtless, and reckless.
John, the Irishman, soon ran away. I got along very well with the others, as they respected me more, because they found Keimer couldn't teach them anything, and they learned something new from me every day. We never worked on Saturday, as that was Keimer's Sabbath, so I had 2 days for reading. I got to know more clever people in town. Keimer himself treated me with great politeness and obvious respect, and the only thing that bothered me now was my debt to Vernon, which I still couldn't pay, as I had been a bad money manager up to that point. However, he kindly didn't ask for it back. Our printing shop often ran out of specific type characters, and there were no type founders in America. I had seen type characters cast at James's in London, but hadn't paid much attention to how it was done. However, I now designed a mold, used the letters we had as punches, pressed the matrices into lead, and in this fairly decent way made up for all the missing pieces. I also engraved several things when needed. I made the ink. I was the warehouse manager, and everything else. In short, I was a jack of all trades. But no matter how useful I was, I noticed that my contributions became less important each day as the other workers got better at the job. And when Keimer paid my second quarter's wages, he told me he thought they were too high and that I should take a pay cut. He gradually became less polite, acted more like a boss, often found fault, was quick to criticize, and seemed ready for a confrontation. Nevertheless, I continued with a lot of patience, thinking that his financial difficulties were partly to blame. Eventually, a small thing broke our connection. A loud noise happened near the courthouse, so I stuck my head out the window to see what was going on. Keimer, who was in the street, looked up and saw me, then yelled at me in a loud, angry voice to mind my own business, adding some insulting words. This annoyed me even more because it was public, with all the neighbors who were also looking out witnessing how he treated me. He immediately came up to the printing shop, continued the argument, harsh words were exchanged, and he gave me the 3 months' notice we had agreed upon, saying he wished he didn't have to give such a long warning. I told him his wish was unnecessary, because I would leave him right then. And so, taking my hat, I walked out, asking Meredith, whom I saw downstairs, to take care of some things I left and bring them to my room. Meredith came that evening, and we discussed my situation. He had developed a great respect for me and really didn't want me to leave while he was still there. He talked me out of returning to my home country, which I had started considering. He reminded me that Keimer was in debt for everything he owned, that his creditors were getting worried,
that he ran his shop poorly, often sold things for cash without making a profit, and often gave credit without keeping records. So he was bound to fail, which would create an opportunity I could take advantage of. I brought up my lack of money. He then told me that his father thought highly of me, and from a conversation they'd had, he was sure his father would lend us money to start our own business if I would go into partnership with him. My contract, he said, will be up with Keimer in the spring. By then, we can have our printing press and typefaces shipped from London. I know I'm not a skilled worker. If you agree, your expertise in the business will count as my share of the investment, and we'll split the profits equally. The offer sounded good, and I agreed. His father was in town and approved of it, especially since he saw I had a lot of influence over his son, had convinced him to stop heavy drinking for a long time, and hoped I might help him break that terrible habit completely once we were so closely involved. I gave an inventory to the father, who took it to a merchant. The items were ordered. The secret was to be kept until they arrived, and in the meantime, I was to find work, if possible, at the other printing shop. But I couldn't find any openings there, so I stayed idle for a few days. Then Keimer, seeing a chance to be hired to print some paper money in New Jersey, which would need engravings and various typefaces that only I could provide, and fearing Bradford might hire me and take the job from him, sent me a very polite message saying that old friends shouldn't separate over a few words spoken in sudden anger, and asking me to come back. Meredith convinced me to agree, as it would give him more chances to improve under my daily teaching. So I went back, and things went more smoothly than they had for a while. We got the New Jersey job, and I designed a copperplate press for it, the first of its kind seen in the country. I engraved several decorative elements and security features for the bills. We went to Burlington together, where I completed the entire job to everyone's satisfaction, and he received such a large payment for the work that it allowed him to stay afloat financially for much longer. In Burlington, I met many important people in the province. Several of them had been appointed by the Assembly to a committee to oversee the printing and ensure that no more bills were printed than the law allowed. So they took turns being with us constantly, and usually whoever was on duty brought a friend or two along for company. Since my mind was much more developed from reading than Keimer's, I guess that's why my conversation seemed to be more valued. They invited me to their homes, introduced me to their friends, and showed me a lot of courtesy, while he, even though he was the boss, was somewhat ignored. Honestly, he was a strange character. He didn't understand everyday life, loved to rudely challenge accepted ideas, was extremely messy, very passionate about some religious beliefs, and a bit dishonest too. We stayed there for nearly 3 months, and by then I could count among my new friends Judge Allen, Samuel Bustill, the province's secretary, Isaac Pearson, Joseph Cooper, several of the Smiths, members of the Assembly, and Isaac Decow, the Surveyor General. The latter was a sharp, wise old man who told me that when he was young, he started out by wheeling clay for brickmakers, learned to write after he became an adult, carried the chain for surveyors who taught him surveying, and had now, through his hard work, acquired a good amount of property, and he said, "I predict that you will soon take this man's business away from him and make a fortune in it in Philadelphia." He had no idea at all then that I intended to start my own business there or anywhere else. These friends later proved very helpful to me, just as I occasionally was to some of them. They all continued to respect me as long as they lived. Before I talk about my public start in business, it might be good to tell you about my state of mind back then regarding my principles and morals, so you can see how much they influenced the future events of my life. My parents had given me religious beliefs early on and raised me devoutly in the dissenting tradition throughout my childhood. But I was barely 15 when, after questioning various points as I found them debated in different books I read, I started to doubt divine revelation itself. I came across some books against deism. They were supposedly the main points of sermons preached at Boyle's lectures. It turned out they had an effect on me completely opposite to what was intended, because the arguments of the deists, which were quoted to be disproved, seemed much stronger to me than the attempts to disprove them. In short, I soon became a complete deist. My arguments led some others astray, especially Collins and Ralph, but since each of them later wronged me greatly without any remorse, and remembering Keith's behavior towards me, who was another free thinker, and my own towards Vernon and Miss Reed, which sometimes caused me a lot of trouble, I began to suspect that this belief, even if true, wasn't very practical. My London pamphlet, which had Dryden's lines as its motto, "Whatever is right, though purblind man sees but a part of the chain, the nearest link, his eyes not carrying to the equal beam that poises all above," and which, based on God's attributes, his infinite wisdom, goodness, and power, concluded that nothing could possibly be wrong in the world, and that vice and virtue were meaningless concepts, not actually existing, now seemed not as clever a work as I once thought it was, and I wondered if some error hadn't unknowingly crept into my argument, infecting everything that followed, as often happens in philosophical discussions. I became convinced that, and in dealings between people, were extremely important for a happy life, and I wrote down resolutions, which are still in my journal, to practice them for as long as I lived. Divine revelation itself didn't hold any sway with me, but I believed that even if certain actions weren't bad just because it forbade them, or good just because it commanded them, it was likely that these forbidden actions were inherently bad for us, and the commanded ones inherently beneficial, considering all the circumstances. And this belief, along with the kind hand of Providence, or some guardian angel, or lucky coincidences, or all of these combined, protected me through this dangerous period of youth and the risky situations I sometimes found myself in among strangers, far from my father's watchful eye and advice, without committing any deliberate major immorality or injustice, which might have been expected given my lack of religious belief. I say deliberate because the examples I've mentioned had some element of excuse in them, due to my youth, inexperience, and the dishonesty of others. So I had a decent reputation to start my life with. I valued it appropriately and was determined to keep it. We hadn't been back in Philadelphia long before the new typefaces arrived from London. We settled our accounts with Keimer and left him, with his permission, before he found out about our plans. We found a house to rent near the market and took it. To reduce the rent, which was only £24 a year back then, though I've since known it to rent for £70, we took in Thomas Godfrey, a glazier, and his family. They were to pay a significant portion of the rent to us, and we would live and eat with them. We had barely opened our mail and set up our press when George House, an acquaintance of mine, brought us a man from the countryside whom he had met in the street asking for a printer. All our money was now spent on the various things we had to buy, and this countryman's 5 shillings, being our very first earnings and coming at such a perfect time, gave me more pleasure than any crown I've earned since. And the gratitude I felt towards House has often made me more willing than I might otherwise have been to help young entrepreneurs.
There are pessimists in every country, always predicting its downfall. One such person lived in Philadelphia at the time, a notable, elderly man with a wise look and a very serious way of speaking. His name was Samuel Mickle. This gentleman, a stranger to me, stopped at my door one day and asked if I was the young man who had recently opened a new printing shop. When I said yes, he told me he felt sorry for me because it was an expensive venture and the money would be wasted. He claimed Philadelphia was a failing city, its people already half bankrupt or close to it. All evidence to the contrary, like new buildings and rising rents, were, to his certain knowledge, misleading. In fact, they were among the very things that would soon ruin us. and he gave me such a detailed list of current and upcoming misfortunes that he left me feeling quite gloomy. If I had known him before starting this business, I probably never would have done it. This man continued to live in this supposedly decaying city and complain in the same way, refusing for many years to buy a house there because everything was going to ruin. And eventually I had the satisfaction of seeing him pay 5 times as much for a house as he could have bought it for when he first started his complaining. I should have mentioned earlier that in the autumn of the previous year, I had gathered most of my clever acquaintances into a club for mutual improvement, which was called the Junto. We met on Friday evenings. The rules I wrote required that each member, when it was their turn, should present 1 or more questions on any topic related to morals, politics, or natural philosophy for the group to discuss, and once every 3 months they had to write and read an essay on any subject they chose. Our discussions were to be led by a president and conducted with a genuine desire to find the truth without loving arguments or wanting to win, and to prevent heated exchanges, all expressions of certainty in opinions or direct contradictions were eventually banned and prohibited with small fines. The first members were Joseph Braintnell, who copied legal documents for scribes, a good-natured, friendly, middle-aged man, a great lover of poetry, reading everything he could find and writing some that was decent. He was very clever with many small gadgets and had intelligent conversations. Thomas Godfrey, a self-taught mathematician, excellent in his field, and later the inventor of what is now called Hadley's Quadrant. But he knew little outside his specialty and wasn't a pleasant companion. Like most great mathematicians I've met, he expected absolute precision in everything said, or he would constantly deny or nitpick over trivial details, disrupting all conversation. He soon left our group. Nicholas Scull, a surveyor, who later became Surveyor General, loved books and sometimes wrote a few poems. William Parsons, trained as a shoemaker, but loving reading, had gained a significant amount of mathematical knowledge, which he first studied with an interest in astrology, though he later laughed at it. He also became Surveyor General. William Moggridge, a carpenter, an extremely skilled craftsman, and a reliable, sensible man. I've already described Hugh Meredith, Stephen Potts, and George Webb. Robert Grace, a young man of some wealth, generous, lively, and witty. He loved wordplay and his friends. And William Coleman, then a merchant's clerk, about my age, who had the calmest, clearest mind, the kindest heart, and the most precise morals of almost anyone I ever met. He later became a very prominent merchant and one of our provincial judges. Our friendship lasted without interruption until his death, for over 40 years, and the club continued almost as long, serving as the best school for philosophy, morality, and politics in the province at that time. Our questions, which were read the week before their discussion, made us read carefully about various subjects so we could speak more effectively. And here we also developed better conversation habits, as our rules were designed to prevent us from annoying each other. That's why the club lasted so long, and I'll have many more opportunities to talk about it later. But I'm telling you about it here to show how much influence I had, with every one of these members actively recommending business to us. Braintnell, in particular, got us the job from the Quakers to print 40 sheets of their history, with Kamer doing the rest, and we worked extremely hard on this because the price was low. It was a large folio, Pro Patria size, using pica type, with smaller, long primer notes. I set 1 sheet of type a day, and Meredith printed it on the press. It was often 11 at night, and sometimes later, before I had finished arranging the type for the next day's work, because the small jobs our other friends sent in occasionally delayed us. But I was so determined to keep doing one sheet of the folio a day that one night, after I had arranged my type forms and thought my day's work was done, one of them accidentally broke, and 2 pages turned into a jumbled mess of type. I immediately sorted and reset it all again before going to bed. And this hard work, visible to our neighbors, started to earn us a good reputation and trust. Specifically, I was told that when our new printing office was mentioned at the Merchants Every Night Club, the general opinion was that it was bound to fail, since there were already 2 printers in town, Kamer and Bradford. But Dr. Baird, whom you and I saw many years later in his hometown, St. Andrews in Scotland, offered a different opinion. "That Franklin's work ethic," he said, "is better than anything I've ever seen. I still see him working when I go home from the club, and he's back at work before his neighbors are even out of bed." This impressed the others, and soon after one of them offered to supply us with stationery. But at that point we chose not to get involved in retail. I'm mentioning this hard work so specifically and openly, even though it might sound like I'm praising myself, so that my descendants who read this will understand the value of that quality when they see its positive impact on my life throughout this story.
George Webb, who had found a female friend who lent him the money to buy out his contract from Keimer, now came to offer himself as a skilled worker to us. We couldn't hire him then, but I foolishly let him in on a secret that I soon planned to start a newspaper and might then have work for him. My hopes for success, as I told him, were based on the fact that the only newspaper at the time, printed by Bradford, was a pathetic publication, poorly managed, not at all entertaining, and yet it was profitable for him. So I figured a good newspaper would almost certainly get good support. I asked Webb not to mention it, but he told Keimer, who immediately, to get ahead of me, published his own plans for printing a newspaper, and Webb was to be employed on it. I was annoyed by this, and to counter their plans, since I couldn't start our paper yet, I wrote several entertaining pieces for Bradford's paper under the title of The Busybody, which Branknell continued for some months. This way, public attention was drawn to that paper, and Keimer's proposals, which we made fun of and ridiculed, were ignored. He started his paper anyway, and after running it for 9 months with at most only 90 subscribers, he offered it to me for a very small price, and I, having been ready for some time to take it over, immediately took charge of it, and in a few years it proved extremely profitable for me. I notice that I tend to speak in the singular, even though our partnership was still ongoing. The reason might be that, in reality, I was responsible for managing the entire business. Meredith wasn't a typesetter, was a bad pressman, and was rarely sober. My friends regretted my association with him, but I had to make the best of the situation. Our first newspapers looked quite different from any before in the province. They used better type and were better printed. But some lively comments I wrote about the ongoing dispute between Governor Burnett and the Massachusetts Assembly impressed the important people, caused the paper and its manager to be widely discussed, and within a few weeks brought them all to become our subscribers. Many followed their example, and our number of subscribers kept growing steadily. This was one of the first good results of my having learned to write a bit. Another was that the influential men, seeing a newspaper now run by someone who could also write well, found it beneficial to support and encourage me. Bradford still printed the votes, laws, and other public documents. He had printed an address from the House to the governor in a crude, error-filled way. We reprinted it elegantly and correctly and sent one to every member. They noticed the difference. It strengthened the position of our friends in the House, and they voted us their official printers for the coming year.
Among my friends in the house, I must not forget Mr. Hamilton, whom I mentioned earlier, who had then returned from England and had a seat there. He strongly supported me in that situation, as he did in many others afterward, continuing his sponsorship until his death. Around this time, Mr. Vernon reminded me of the debt I owed him, but he didn't pressure me. I wrote him an honest letter of apology, begged for a little more patience, which he granted, and as soon as I could, I paid back the original amount with interest and many thanks, so that mistake was somewhat corrected.
But now another problem arose that I had absolutely no reason to expect. Mr. Meredith's father, who was supposed to pay for our printing shop, according to what I had been led to believe, was only able to provide £100 in currency, which had been paid, and another 100 was owed to the merchant, who became impatient and sued all of us. We posted bail, but realized that if the money couldn't be raised in time, the lawsuit would soon result in a judgment and seizure of assets, and our promising future, along with us, would be ruined, as the press and type would have to be sold for payment, perhaps at half price. In this difficult situation, two true friends, whose kindness I have never forgotten and never will forget as long as I live, came to me separately, without knowing about each other, and without me even asking. Each offered to lend me all the money I would need to take over the entire business myself, if that was feasible, but they didn't like the idea of me continuing the partnership with Meredith, who, they said, was often seen drunk in the streets and gambling in taverns, which was very bad for our reputation. These two friends were William Coleman and Robert Grace. I told them I couldn't suggest ending the partnership as long as there was any chance of the Merediths fulfilling their part of our agreement, because I felt very indebted to them for what they had done and would do if they could. But if they ultimately failed to perform, and our partnership had to be dissolved, then I would feel free to accept my friend's help. So the matter stood for some time, until I said to my partner, "Perhaps your father isn't happy with your involvement in our business and isn't willing to lend money for both of us, though he would for you alone. If that's the case, tell me, and I'll give the whole thing to you and go my own way." "No," he said, "my father has truly been disappointed and genuinely can't help, and I don't want to burden him further. I see this is a business I'm not suited for. I was raised as a farmer, and it was foolish of me to come to town and, at 30 years old, apprentice myself to learn a new trade. Many of our Welsh people are going to settle in North Carolina, where land is cheap. I'm inclined to go with them and go back to my old job. You might find friends to help you. If you take on the company's debts, return the £100 my father advanced to him, pay my small personal debts, and give me £30 and a new saddle, I will give up the partnership and leave everything to you." I agreed to this offer. It was written down, signed, and sealed immediately. I gave him what he asked for, and he left soon after for Carolina, from where he sent me 2 long letters the next year containing the best description that had been given of that country, its climate, soil, farming, etc., because he was very knowledgeable about those things. I printed them in the newspapers, and they were very well received by the public. As soon as he left, I went back to my two friends, and because I didn't want to unfairly favor either of them, I took half of what each had offered, and what I needed from one, and half from the other. I paid off the company's debts and continued the business under my own name, announcing that the partnership was over. I think this was around 1729.